So I thought it might make sense to go ahead and do some audio content since our topic is podcasting. And this is actually a kind of audio work that I've done quite a bit of. I've never actually made a quote unquote podcast in that particular genre, but I've done a lot of online presentation composing and delivering, let's put it that way, for the context of online courses and hybrid courses. So it's a form that I really like, and it's again sort of where I've practiced this a little bit anyway. Not that I don't have a lot to learn still. So anyway, what I want to do today in this online presentation is describe where we are in the design process. So that's one of the structural pieces we're doing in this class. I'm hoping that when you exit the class, you will know more about the design process at that point than you did when you entered. And that's the I guess you'd say that's the primary framework we are working on. That's the structure, that is, to hang the idea of podcasting and storytelling on that structure. So the phases of the design process are pretty simple to remember as a kind of acronym of ADDIE, A-D-D-I-E. So analysis, design, development, implementation, and evaluation. That's pretty much the algorithm, although, and I'll repeat this later also, it's not necessarily to be followed in a linear fashion. And there are some other permutations of that basic framework that designers make in order to have the process fit the nature of the project they're working on. So where we are in this process is in the analysis phase, but we'll be moving through this entire um, set of stages or phases. So you notice when David Smith was visiting and doing a guest presentation for us, he referred to the initial phase as suiting up, and I think that's an interesting example of what you'll see in studying the design process across numerous contexts. Very often the different contexts have different terminology for more or less the same framework. So suiting up is sort of like analysis. What he was referring to is the work we had done looking at the context for podcasting, what is going on in the culture that's supporting it, that's giving it its staying power, those kind of questions we ask. That's all sort of in the category of analysis, or in his terminology, kind of suiting up and getting ready, getting prepared, setting a stage. Basically, the reason I think the terminology can be used interchangeably is that the process itself, the design process, is really natural, universal, and in that same category, rooted in the brain. So in effect, designers pretty much just slow the process down and make it more deliberate and intentional. But again, it's what's more or less going on in our brains all the time. So for example, looking at this diagram of the cycle that the brain goes through. There, you might start with, for example, abstract hypotheses on the left-hand side, and imagine that as sort of the analysis part, right? So you're coming up with sort of ideas and about things, and you're putting it in a framework. You're figuring things out, just forming an idea, and then you're moving up to going kind of clockwise to active testing. Would be more like maybe design and development, where you're actually got your idea and you're now putting it into some kind of concrete form. And then again, in the design process, that would be the design and development phases. And then the implementation, the sort of concrete experience of doing it, whatever you decided, if your brain has decided that it's okay to walk across that bridge or whatever, based on you've maybe stepped out there a few steps, it seems solid enough, etc. You basically then go ahead and try the concrete experience of crossing the bridge, right? And so there's that kind of thing that more or less correlates in the design process to the implementation phase. So we've already got analysis, design development into implementation. That bottom part of this diagram, the reflective observation, would then correspond to the evaluation. So you might cross that bridge, and in reflection you might go, I think I'm going to take a different route back or whatever. Or that was fine, you reflect on it and you would maybe change the way you did it, you maybe would hesitate less, etc. You're reflecting, observing, and then you keep going around the cycle. You then you go back to abstract hypothesis, and you then revise your hypothesis. And so whatever it was, it now has some additional experience. And so this is why the design process is sort of polysemic, in the sense that there's a lot of different types of terminology one can use to describe it. But it all kind of goes back to this kind of, for lack of a better word, common sense notion of a kind of cycle that the brain goes through naturally. So to go back to the ADDIE process, analysis, design, develop, implement, evaluate, the idea again here to let sink in is that the process is iterative. It's not sequential. You just do one and then go the other. You might go around this wheel several times in the course of one project, and it's not strictly sequential. So you may jump in at some different point, and you may work backwards, or there may be, like, you notice that little ring of circles in the middle there, kind of smaller. It's almost like a subroutine. You can imagine that, like, for example, in design and development, you might go back and forth, and that sort of tiny wheel may spin around in between design and develop a few times before you would actually move on. And there's some changes in there, like the that are possible. So, for example, David Smith talked about prototyping, and that is an example of sort of designing and developing at the same time, to hopefully save time and increase the amount of learning that you would get from the early stages. It might be wise to do your analysis or do your suiting up and then move right into a prototype, design and develop something quickly. So you're not totally invested in it or don't have an ownership relationship to the content yet, but you're just trying something, but kind of packaging it in a way that has some characteristics you think you might expand on. And that's likely something we'll want to do with our podcasts, is once we have the ideas sort of laid out and enough for the kind of conceptual design, identification of storyline and theme and that kind of thing, then I think it might make sense just to sort of cook up a prototype episode and push it out into the room of your groups and also the larger group possibly, and we'll see how that goes. And then that gives you some, maybe like kind of a shortcut to developing the content for a podcast. And again, in this case, with this particular kind of project, I think it argues pretty strongly for the production of a prototype, so that you would be able to do the hands-on part in conjunction with thinking about what you're doing and get some active feedback, both on the conceptual side and also on the technical formal side. So anyway, that's the notions there to take away are that the process is iterative. It's not like a this, then that, then this, and then done. It's a constant process, more or less. You just put parameters around it for a design project, and then to underscore that it's not sequential, that it can be entered into at various points, and it can also be back and forth between a couple stages if that's needed. So where we are is in the analysis phase, and we're kind of wrapping that phase up now. That's one of the purposes of this particular talk, I guess you could call it. So in our work thus far, we have completed some cultural, contextual audience analysis, or again, suiting up by gathering that data bank of favorite podcasts, creating a data bank of knowledge and skills, forming groups and talking about among ourselves, talking about the reasons for the staying power of podcasting. And so this was where I learned a lot. I think we all did, of each other's insights into this particular genre and why it's sticking around, right? And so I think we had a good conversation there. And I do want to take a quick little segue here to talk about that conversation. I thought it was a pretty noteworthy face-to-face conversation we had about the social context or cultural context of podcasting. And because I'm a fan of conversation, and because I know that a lot of people in this class are going to take up projects that might involve conversation slash interview material, I wanted to share this with you. This is something that's stuck with me for a long time in terms of kind of taxonomy about different types of conversations. It helps to be able to kind of name the world in this way. So in this case, the world of conversation. So this is from a couple researchers, Patrick Genlink and Alison Carr, I think their names were. But anyway, they made this categorization of conversations into transactional ones, the sort of just getting some business done, just the facts, that kind of thing. Transformational conversations are, again, get more complex. So that's where the conversation would actually change your perspective. It would transform your perspective. And then the third type of conversation is the to some extent best kind, and that's the transcendent one, where you lose track of time. You just have the sense that there's a kind of synergy happening, like the insights are being generated, and you're not really sensing a lot of outside stimulation other than that's going on inside the conversation. So the kind of thing where I think we had some of that in our class conversation about the context of podcasting, a sense of losing track of time. Typical also, like late night conversations maybe, where you just go, oh my gosh, someone looks at a clock and realizes it's really gotten late, because the conversation is just a rich one and becomes transcendent. So this is useful, I think, for thinking about what you're after. Are you trying to get, if you're just imagining you're having interviews as part of your design framework for your podcast, are you wanting this to be, the character of these interactions to be transactional, transformational, transcendent, sort of on air, so to speak? Like obviously you can't exactly predict whether these things might be happening to a listener, but you might be able to aim your own conversations or be able to steer them a little better by having these categories. So to go back to the ship here, we are wrapping up the analysis phase, and we have done various things to kind of set up shop, suit up, or analyze context, audience, culture, etc. And we have also looked at the formal, technical, and phenomenological, it's a mouthful of a word there, aspects of podcasts. So we looked at the Kevin Roose article, What's Behind the Great Podcast Renaissance, and his conclusion, more or less, I said more to say than this, but more or less that the big factor is the mobile storytelling that podcasting enables, and the sort of user-controlled content, I think, is another part of that mobile story, that you can start and stop it. You play it wherever and whenever you want. So it's very user-driven. And the Robert McDougall article, our new AURAL, AURAL, Ecologies, Podcasting, Publicity, and Secondary Orality, got us into that phenomenological aspect of podcasts. That you might call it sort of the intimacy of orality, the kind of sense that you have that listening to a podcast is kind of like a one-on-one conversation, where if you have earbuds in or something, the person talking is right inside your head. I mean, literally, So there's that type of aspect that I think we need to keep in mind in terms of when we're making these things, right? So it's very different from a public address, and that's what the notion of publicity is. It's sort of like public-private. It's a different kind of category, and so is secondary orality as far as that goes. And I'll say more about that concept in just a moment. But anyway, we did did those things, those articles, to kind of get at the cultural context and the phenomenological or the highly individual slash intimate context. We did, again, some additional formal technical and phenomenological analysis by selecting and examining favorite podcasts. So everyone picked one and did a kind of analysis of it. So all of this, I think we did a pretty good job of at least, starting. We might want to iterate this, but a good start on cultural analysis, right? So we and also these other kinds, formal and phenomenological and audience, all of that. So what I wanted to do in the next couple slides is just introduce tie a bow on this analysis phase. I wanted to introduce three characters, so to speak, that wrote some of the early history of the context for to sort of the intersecting context of media and storytelling. So these are three individuals: Marshall McLuhan, Walter Ong, and Len Masterman. So I'm going to kind of introduce these people as context masters or mavens to sort of complete the background painting part of the analysis. So McLuhan, very interesting character, was sort of the grandfather of media studies in many ways, particularly contemporary media, starting with radio and TV, and then moving on. A true giant of a thinker that still, basically, I think the field of media studies owes a great deal to. And so McLuhan had this idea pertinent to our task of learning about and learning how to make podcasts. He had this idea that we were entering basically an acoustic age. And so it's actually a pretty profound proposition that he suggested that the world is now so different through the kind of continual wash of new media over the social sphere, that it's reality's behaving in a way that's hard to capture with visual metaphors. And so his idea, one of the depth dimensions of his idea, is that we need to literally start using acoustic or aural metaphors to understand the world, because those metaphors, in his view, fit the reality much better than visual ones do. So he started to lay the groundwork at a theoretical level for this kind of development and incursion and then recursion, really a return of podcasting. Anyway, McLuhan, a very important scholar, taken seriously as a media studies person and also as a philosopher, really. So he's definitely a background painter who also stepped out in his day. Some of you may know him already. Stepped out in his day from the world of being a University of Toronto scholar, actually trained in English literature, basically an English professor who jumped out into kind of trying to find something a little more relevant to talk about. But he also made lots and lots of connections between his literary work and his kind of cultural slash media work. So for example, he very often will talk and write about James Joyce, the noted novelist. He studied Joyce really closely and uses some of the material that Joyce touched on in his novels in his media analysis, right? So he was an integrative person, and included that he stepped out into become sort of a pop culture figure, very similar to the way in which Andy Warhol did the same in the visual arts at right about the same time. Stepped out into the pop culture sphere and became a known kind of character, to the extent that Woody Allen included McLuhan, he's on the right here, included him in this pretty famous scene at this point for media studies people anyway, in Annie Hall, a very humorous scene and stuff. But this is the sort of this is what I mean by he kind of stepped out. So he became a kind of known figure outside of the boundaries of academic life. So that was McLuhan, but the point I want you to remember is that he was already talking about the importance in the age of new media, again going all the way back to radio and TV, that the speed of change and all of those kind of things, which to us has become sort of a cliche kind of thing, but at the time would have been, basically the first person noticing that was producing some changes in its wake, right? That it was reorganizing the way we experience reality and reorganizing it in a way that made audio or oral or acoustic content make a lot more sense, with a lot more keyed to the times. So that's one angle there. Another figure who actually was a known figure to McLuhan. These guys were both in their prime at about the same time. Walter Ong was a scholar of historical linguistics who took this grounding of orality in human culture and life really to a different, even longer historical lens dimension, right? So he talked about his most famous book is called Orality and Literacy: The Technologizing of the Word, and in that book he pretty much makes a very exhaustive documentation of the thesis that for human beings historically speaking has been much more important than writing. I mean, the kind of obvious thing was that humans were speaking for many eons before there was anything like writing, and so writing was kind of like an anomaly. Now he's a guy that is a supporter of writing, right? It's a really nice medium, and he also refers to writing as a technology, right? And this again, he grounds this in historical studies. The ancient Greeks, who were one of the cultures who in the classical phase of that culture were undergoing the kind of transition to the new media on the scene. What then that day was writing, and he was one of the first to point out that there was a lot of pushback against writing, in much the same way that when TV came out, people felt like there was it was just evil incarnate or whatever. Same thing holds with the initial reception to writing, and so Ong was important in two ways. He talked about the primacy of orality in human history, going way back, and then kind of he has this concept secondary orality, which is about the contemporary moment of a kind of return to orality. That he calls secondary orality, and that is reflective in everything that we do on a routine basis these days without thinking much about it. So the short summary of this is that writing has become a lot more like talking than it was even 50 years ago, with through most of the forms of communication we all do routinely, including email, texting, participating in forums, etc. It's all pretty much in some respect anyway, conversational writing. It's at least multi-dimensional, multi-user writing. So he noted that we're in an age and that's why he calls it secondary. We're in an age that combines writing and speaking in a lot of different ways, including I like to generate a lot of the text I need to generate. I generate it by talking and let a text to audio program speaking to text. Yeah, but I also do it the other way too of doing the text to speech or speech to text. So that's what Ong makes us aware of, that we're kind of recapturing this kind of primordial past, really, of being oral storytellers for a much longer time than we were ever written storytellers. So the third person I want to introduce is Len Masterman, again a really important early out kind of media theorist out of the UK, who pioneered this idea of there being kind of phases of adoption of new media, and so it goes through phases of the first phase being inoculation, where people again think of it as some sort of like a terrible ooze that's slides under your door. It's like toxic, and so people have to inoculate themselves against it. That's the initial kind of reception. Second level of reception is when people kind of get over that panic part and try to make meaningful distinctions between good and not so good content, and a media literate person would try to cleave to the good and stay on the side of educational sort of artistic content as opposed to just sort of like drecky stuff. So that would be the second thing, and he called that the popular arts phase, where people started to make distinctions and started to make programs. So the era of Sesame Street and TV and those kind of things, where people said, okay, so now we realize it can either be for the better or for the worse, and so we're going to make it for the better. We're going to try to do some things with this new media that make things better. So that's the second phase. The third phase is what he calls the investigative phase, and that's where people started to get interested in things like media ownership patterns and monopoly, and the effect of consolidation of media, given that it's a powerful, proven to be a powerful, influence in culture and societies. So people started to investigate the sort of agendas of news organizations and other entities, and so that's a third phase in Masterman's framework. And then the last phase in his framework would be, again, directly speaking to what we're doing in this class. He called it the empowerment phase, and that's when the title shift occurs to where people are routinely making media using these tools rather than just passively receiving information and perspectives and stuff. You're actually making, sharing content, making and sharing content of your own. It can be content, it can be perspective, right? So there's a nice sort of trio of people there that speak to the deep cultural background of podcasting, where podcasting kind of fits in. So you have McLuhan and Ong and Masterman as people to consider. So where we are then in the phase right now is in the design process right now is we're kind of wrapping up the analysis phase. Again, it's never totally done. We might do more analysis another time around the wheel or whatnot, but for now we're kind of wrapping up that phase and getting ready to start the design process in earnest. And we've already kind of done that already with the reading by James Webb Young, a technique for producing ideas, and listening to David Smith, who brought an interesting perspective of his own, based in part, the exercise he did anyway was based in part on the work of IDEO. IDEO, that's an acronym for something, I'm not sure what, but anyway, it's a design thinking type of organization. So that kind of activity is something that they have kind of formalized. So we're starting to do the design of these podcasts already by talking about, again, slowing the process down and actually looking pretty zoomed in on how we come up with ideas and how we might actually get better at that, or how we might find ways to incorporate other perspectives into our own ideas. And so we'll be working with that a little bit in class. So anyway, we're starting that now, the design phase, by doing ideation. We're going to extend that when Ron Stacker Thompson comes to visit on Friday. He will be talking about that second twin tower of storytelling, and so we want to have these kind of topic areas, firmly in grasp right at the beginning of the design phase. So what are we designing? Where does it fit in? We're kind of doing two different things here, right? So we're designing around an idea, what we think is a good idea, mindful of David's distinction between good ideas and successful ones. So what we're trying to do is come up with successful ideas for podcasts, and then we're trying to, the next process, the very next one really, is to kind of decide what the story is going to be. What is the overarching story this podcast tells, so to speak? Even if it's a story told in interviews or whatnot, I think we still have to think about what that story is. So that's what Ron Stacker Thompson will help us with. And I'm also hoping that he will share some insight on what is involved in creating and receiving as well serialized or serial content. Since what our task is going to be is design podcasts that are basically one coherent season or series, and that way we can adjust the number of episodes to the to meet the kind of feasibility requirements that David mentioned so well, that it's part of what a successful idea is what makes it successful is that it's doable. And so we want to make sure that our ideas meet that test also. So this is all like moving pretty much firmly into the design phase. So for homework, what I want you to do before Friday is read a short chapter to sort of plant a seed for the storytelling that's going to follow on Friday in class when Ron Stacker Thompson comes to visit. So we're basically, we want to hone in on ideas, and then we want to figure out what stories or ideas are going to prompt us to tell. And I do have a kind of reading that I want you to do for Friday to get us out ahead of the curve a little bit, to start thinking about the particularities again of orality or acoustic delivery. This, I think, is an important little article here. It's actually a chapter in a book called Writing for Broadcast. And the chapter is called Sound Reporting, the NPR Guide to Audio Journalism and Production. Now, this is a very practical article. This is basically going to be talking to you about how to write content that is intended to be spoken. And so it's a different type of writing, and NPR obviously is an organization with a lot of sort of experience in this type of writing, and as well as in the delivery of it. So I want to start us thinking a little bit about the technical aspects of writing, and I think this will dovetail well and converge well with whatever Ron tells us on Friday about storytelling itself. And so I think we're in good shape here to read this chapter for Friday in advance of his visit on that day. So that's the kind of homework looking forward. So he's gonna help us in a couple different ways to get a kind of both our feet in the design phase of the process, and we want to again keep these things in mind, that we want to come up with not only a successful idea, but one according to that definition that is feasible to produce. And so these are all topics we're going to start sort of juggling this week. That's our aim, and then we'll move even deeper into the design process. And fairly quickly in that process, we're going to go ahead and generate a prototype. And so that'll be something that'll be coming up fairly quickly on the horizon, in the wake of these sort of introductory conceptual introductions to the topics we've been looking at, ideation and then storytelling. So I hope this has been helpful, and I will be seeing you all on Wednesday, and then again guest speaker on Friday.